The Language of African Literature by Ngũgĩ Thiong'o. As a writer who believes in the utilization of African ideas, African philosophy, and African folklore and imagery to the fullest extent possible, I am of the opinion the only way to use them effectively is to translate them almost literally from the African language native to the writer into whatever European language he is using as medium of expression. I have endeavored in my words to keep as close as possible to the vernacular expressions. For from a word, a group of words, a sentence, or even a name in any African language, one can glean the social norms, attitudes, and values of a people. In order to capture the vivid images of African speech, I had to eschew the habit of expressing my thoughts first in English. It was difficult at first, but I had to learn. I had to study each Ijaw expression I used and discover the probable situation in which it was used in order to bring out the nearest meaning in English. I found it a fascinating exercise. Why, we may ask, should an African writer or any writer become so obsessed by taking from his mother tongue to enrich other tongues? Why should he see it as his particular mission? We never asked ourselves, how can we enrich our languages? How can we pry on the rich humanist and democratic heritage and the struggles of other peoples in other times and other places to enrich our own? Why not have Balzac, Tolstoy, Sholokov, Brecht, Lushun, Pablo Neruda, H.C. Andersen, Kim Chi-ha, Marx, Lenin, Albert Einstein, Galileo, Aeschylus, Aristotle, and Plato in African languages? And why not create literary monuments in our own languages? Why, in other words, should Gabriel Okara, quoted above, not sweat it out to create an Ijaw, which he acknowledged to have depth of philosophy and a wide range of ideas and experiences? What was our responsibility to the struggles of African peoples? No, these questions were not asked. What seemed to worry us more was this. After all, the literary gymnastics of prying on our languages to add life and vigor to English and other foreign languages, will the result be accepted as good English or good French? Will the owner of the language criticize our usage? Here we were more assertive of our rights, Chinua Achebe wrote. I feel that the English language will be able to carry the weight of my African experience, but it will have to be in New English, still in full communion with its ancestral home, but altered to suit new African surroundings. Gabriel Okara's position on this was representative of our generation. Some may regard this way of writing English language as a desecration of the language. This is of course not true. Living languages grow like living things, and English is far from a dead language. There are American, West Indian, Australian, Canadian, and New Zealand versions of English. All of them add life and vigor to the language while reflecting their own respective cultures. Why shouldn't there be a Nigerian or West African English which we can use to express our own ideas, thinking, and philosophy in our own way? How did we arrive at this acceptance of the fatalistic logic of the unassailable position of English in our literature, in our culture, in our politics? What was the route from the Berlin of 1884 via the Makerere of 1962 to what is still the prevailing and dominant logic 100 years later? How did we as African writers come to be so feeble towards the claims of our languages on us and so aggressive in our claims on other languages, particularly the languages of our colonialization? Berlin of 1884 was effected through the sword and the bullet. But the night of the sword and the bullets was followed by the morning of the chalk and the blackboard. The physical violence of the battlefield was followed by the psychological violence of the classroom. But where the former was visibly brutal, the latter was visibly gentle. A process best described in Sheikh Hamid Okeng's novel, Ambiguous Adventure, where he talks of the methods of the colonial phase of imperialism as consisting of knowing how to kill with efficiency and to heal with the same art. On the Black continent, one began to understand that their real power resided not at all in the canons of the first morning, but in what followed the canons. Therefore, behind the canons was the new school. The new school had the nature of both the canon and the magnet. From the canon, it took the efficiency of a fighting weapon. But better than the canon, it made the conquest permanent. The canon forces the body, and the school fascinates the soul. In my view, language was the most important vehicle through which that power fascinated and held the soul prisoner. The bullet was the means of the physical subjugation. Language was the means of spiritual subjugation. Let me illustrate this by drawing upon experiences in my own education, particularly in language and literature. I was born into a large peasant family, father, 4 wives, and about 28 children. I also belonged, as we all did in those days, to a wider extended family and to the community as a whole. We spoke Gikuyu as we walked in the fields. We spoke Gikuyu in and outside the home. I can vividly recall those evenings of storytelling around the fireside. It was mostly the grown-ups telling the children, but everybody was interested and involved. We children would retell the stories the following day to other children who walked in the fields picking the pyrethrum flowers, tea leaves, or coffee beans of our European and African landlords. The stories, with mostly animals as the main characters, were all told in Gikuyu. Hair, being small, weak but full of innovative wit and cunning, was our hero. We identified with him as he struggled against the brutes of prey like lion, leopard, hyena. His victories were our victories, and we learned that the apparent weak can outwit the strong. We followed the animals in their struggle against hostile nature. Drought, rain, sun, wind, a confrontation often forcing them to search for forms of cooperation. But we were also interested in their struggles amongst themselves, and particularly between the beast and the victims of prey. These twin struggles against nature and other animals reflected real-life struggles in the human world. Not that we neglected stories with human beings as the main characters. There were 2 types of characters in such human-centered narratives: the species of truly human beings with qualities of courage, kindness, mercy, hatred of evil, concern for others, and a man-eats-man, 2-mouthed species with qualities of greed, selfishness, individualism, and hatred of what was good for the larger cooperative community. Cooperation as the ultimate good in a community was a constant theme. It could unite human beings with animals against ogres and beasts of prey, as in the story of how Dove, after being fed with castor oil seed, was sent to fetch a smith walking far away from home and whose pregnant wife was being threatened by these man-eating 2-mouthed ogres. There were good and bad storytellers. A good one could tell the same story over and over again, and it would always be fresh to us, the listeners. He or she could tell a story told by someone else and make it more alive and dramatic. The differences really were in the use of words and images and the inflection of voices to effect different tones. We therefore learned to value words for their meaning and nuances. Language was not a mere string of words. It had a suggestive power well beyond the immediate and lexical meaning. Our appreciation of the suggestive magical power of language was reinforced by the games we played with words through riddles, proverbs, transposition of syllables, or through nonsensical but musical arranged words. So we learned the music of our language on top of the content. The language, through image and symbols, gave us a view of the world, but it had a beauty of its own. The home and the field were then our pre-primary school, But what is important for this discussion is that the language of our evening teachings and the language of our immediate and wider community and the language of our work in the fields were one. And then I went to school, a colonial school, and this harmony was broken. The language of my education was no longer the language of my culture. I first went to Kamandura, missionary run, and then to another called Mangu, run by nationalists grouped around the Gikuyu Independent and Karinga School Association. Our language of education was still Gikuyu. The very first time I was ever given an ovation for my writing was over a composition in Gikuyu. So for my first 4 years, there was still harmony between the language of my formal education and that of the Lemuru peasant community. It was after the declaration of a state of emergency over Kenya in 1952 that all the schools run by patriotic nationalists were taken over by the colonial regime and were placed under district education boards chaired by Englishmen. English became the language of my formal education. In Kenya, English became more than a language. It was the language, and all the others had to bow before its indifference. Thus, one of the most humiliating experiences was to be caught speaking Gikuyu in the vicinity of the school. The culprit was given corporal punishment, 3 to 5 strokes of the cane on bare buttocks, or was made to carry a metal plate around the neck with inscriptions such as "I am stupid" or "I am a donkey." Sometimes the culprits were fined money they could hardly afford. And how did the teachers catch the culprits? A button was initially given to one pupil who was supposed to hand it over to whoever was caught speaking his mother tongue. Whoever had the button at the end of the day would sing who had given it to him, and the ensuing process would bring out all the culprits of the day. Thus, children were turned into witch hunters, and in the process were being taught the lucrative value of being a traitor to one's immediate community. The attitude to English was the exact opposite. Any achievement in spoken or written English was highly rewarded. Prizes, prestige, applause, the ticket to higher realms. English became the measure of intelligence and ability in the arts and sciences, and all the other branches of learning. English became the main determinant of a child's progress up the ladder of formal education. As you may know, the colonial system of education, in addition to its apartheid racial demarcation, had the structure of a pyramid. A broad primary base, a narrowing secondary middle, and an even narrower university apex. Selections from the primary into secondary were through an examination, in my time called Kenyan African Preliminary Examination, in which one had to pass 6 subjects ranging from maths to nature study and Kiswahili. All papers were written in English. Nobody could pass the exam who failed the English language paper, no matter how brilliantly he had done in other subjects. I remember a boy in my class of 1954 who had distinctions in all subjects except English, which he had failed. He was made to fail the entire exam. He went on to become a turn boy in a bus company. I, who had only passes but a credit in English, got a place at the Alliance High School, one of the most elitist institutions for Africans in colonial Kenya. The requirements for a place at the university, Makerere University College, were broadly the same. Nobody could go in to wear the undergraduate's red gown, no matter how brilliantly they had performed in all the other subjects, unless they had a credit, not even a simple pass in English. Thus, the most coveted place in the pyramid and in the system was only available to the holder of an English language credit card. English was the official vehicle and the magic formula to colonial elitedom. Literary education was now determined by the dominant language while also reinforcing that dominance. Oral literature in Kenyan language stopped. In primary school, I now read simplified Dickens and Stevenson alongside Rider Haggard, Jim Hawkins, Oliver Twist, Tom Brown. Not hare, leopard, and lion were now my daily companions in the world of imagination. In secondary school, Scott and G.B. Shaw vied with more Rider Haggard, John Buchan, Alan Payton, Captain W.E. Jones. At Makerere, I read English from Chaucer to T.S. Eliot with a touch of Graham Greene. Thus, language and literature were taking us further and further from ourselves to other selves, from our world to other worlds. What was the colonial system doing to us Kenyan children? What were the consequences of, on the one hand, this systematic suppression of our languages and the literature they carried, and on the other hand, the elevation of English and the literature it carried? To answer those questions, let me first examine the relationship of language to human experience, human culture, and the human perception of reality. Language, any language, has a dual character. It is both a means of communication and a carrier of culture. Take English. It is spoken in Britain and in Sweden and in Denmark. But for Swedish and Danish people, English is only a means of communication with non-Scandinavians. It is not a carrier of their culture. For the British, and particularly the English, it is additionally and inseparably from its use as a tool of communication, a carrier of their culture and history. Or take Swahili in East and Central Africa. It is widely used as a means of communication across many nationalities, but it is not the carrier of a culture and history of many of those nationalities. However, in parts of Kenya and Tanzania, and particularly in Zanzibar, Swahili is inseparably both a means of communication and a carrier of the culture of those people to whom it is a mother tongue. Language as communication has three aspects or elements. There is first what Karl Marx once called the language of real life, the elements basic to the whole notion of language, its origin and development. That is, the relations people enter into with one another in the labor process, the links they necessarily establish among themselves in the act of a people, a community of human beings producing wealth or means of life like food, clothing, houses. A human community really starts its historical being as a community of cooperation in production through the division of labor. The simplest is between man, woman, and child within a household. The more complex divisions are between branches of production, such as those who are sole hunters, sole gatherers of fruit, or sole workers in metal. Then there are the most complex divisions, such as those in modern factories, where a single product, say a shirt or a shoe, is the result of many hands and minds. Production is cooperation, is communication, is language, is expression of a relation between human beings, and it is specifically human. The second aspect of language as communication is speech, and it imitates the language of real life. That is communication in production. The verbal signposts both reflect and aid communication or the relations established between human beings in the production of their means of life. Language as a system of verbal signposts makes that production possible. The spoken words is the relations between human beings, while the hand is the relations between human beings and nature. The hand, through tools, meditates between human beings and nature and forms the language of real life. Spoken words mediate between human beings and form the language of speech. The third aspect is the written signs. The written word imitates the spoken. Where the first two aspects of language as communication through the hand and the spoken word historically evolved more or less simultaneously, the written aspect is a much later historical development. Writing is representation of sounds with visual symbols. From the simplest note among shepherds to tell the number in a head, or the hieroglyphics among the Aguko Ikigande singers and poets of Kenya, to the most complicated and different letter and picture writing systems of the world today. In most societies, the written and the spoken languages are the same in that they represent each other. What is on paper can be read to another person and be received as that language which the recipient has grown up speaking. In such a society, there is broad harmony for a child between the three aspects of language as communication. His interaction with nature and with other men are expressed in written and spoken symbols or signs which are both a result of that double interaction and a reflection of it. The association of the child's sensibility is with the language of his experience of life. But there is more to it. Communication between human beings is also the basis and process of evolving culture. In doing similar kinds of things and actions over and over again under similar circumstances, similar even in their mutability, certain patterns, moves, rhythms, habits, attitudes, experiences, and knowledge emerge. Those experiences are handed over to the next generation and become the inherited basis for their further actions on their nature and on themselves. There is a gradual accumulation of values which in time become almost self-evident truths governing their conception of what is right and wrong, good and bad, beautiful and ugly, courageous and cowardly, generous and mean in their internal and external relations. Over a time, this becomes a way of life distinguishable from other ways of life. They develop a distinctive culture and history. Culture embodies those moral, ethical, and aesthetic values, the set of spiritual eyeglasses through which they come to view themselves and their place in the universe. Values are the basis of a people's identity, their sense of particularity as members of the human race. All this is carried by language. Language as culture is the collective memory bank of a people's experience in history. Culture is almost indistinguishable from the language that makes possible its genesis, growth, banking, articulation, and indeed its transmission from one generation to the next. Language as culture also has three important aspects. Culture is a product of the history which it in turn reflects. Culture, in other words, is a product and a reflection of human beings communicating with one another in the very struggle to create wealth and to control it. But culture does not merely reflect that history, or rather it does so by actually forming images or pictures of the world of nature and nurture. Thus, the second aspect of language as culture is as an image-forming agent in the mind of a child. Our whole conception of ourselves as a people, individually and collectively, is based on those pictures and images, which may or may not correctly correspond to the actual reality of the struggles with nature and nurture which produced them in the first place. But our capacity to confront the world creatively is dependent on how those images correspond or not to that reality, how they distort or clarify the reality of our struggles. Language as culture is thus mediating between me and my own self, between my own self and other selves, between me and nature. Language is mediating in my very being. And this brings us to the third aspect of language as culture. Culture transmits or impacts those images of the world and reality through the spoken and the written language, that is, through a specific language. In other words, the capacity to speak, the capacity to utter sound in a manner that makes for mutual comprehension between human beings is universal. This is the universality of language, a quality specific to human beings. It corresponds to the universality of the struggle against nature, and that between human beings. But the particularity of the sounds, the words, the word order into phrases and sentences, and the specific manner or laws of their ordering is what distinguishes one language from another. Thus, a specific culture is not transmitted through language in its universality, but in its particularity as the language of a specific community with a specific history. Written literature and orature are the main means by which a particular language transmits the images of the world contained in the culture it carries. Language as communication and as culture are then products of each other. Communication creates culture. Culture is a means of communication. Language carries culture, and culture carries, particularly through orature and literature, the entire body of values by which we come to perceive ourselves and our place in the world. How people perceive themselves affects how they look at their culture, at their politics, and at the social production of wealth, at their entire relationship to nature and to other beings. Language is thus inseparable from ourselves as a community of human beings with a specific form and character, a specific history, a specific relationship to the world. So what was the colonialist imposition of a foreign language doing to us children? The real aim of colonialism was to control the people's wealth, what they produced, how they produced it, and how it was distributed. To control, in other words, the entire realm of the language of real life. Colonialism imposed its control of the social production of wealth through military conquest and subsequent political dictatorship. But its most important area of domination was the mental universe of the colonized, the control through culture of how people perceive themselves and their relationship to the world. Economic and political control can never be complete or effective without mental control. To control a people's culture is to control their tools of self-definition in relationship to others. For colonialism, these involve two aspects of the same process: the destruction or the deliberate undervaluing of a people's culture, their arts, dances, religions, history, geography, education, orature, and literature, and the conscious elevation of the language of the colonizer. The domination of a people's language by the languages of the colonizing nations was crucial to the domination of the mental universe of the colonized. Taking language as communication, imposing a foreign language and suppressing the native language as spoken and written were already breaking the harmony previously existing between the African child and the three aspects of language. Since the new language as a means of communication was a product of and was reflecting the real language of life elsewhere, it could never, as spoken or written, properly reflect or imitate the real life of that community. This may in part explain why technology always appears to us as slightly external, their product and not ours. The word missile used to hold an alien faraway sound until I recently learnt its equivalent in Gikuyu, Ngurukuki, and it made me apprehend it differently. Learning for a colonial child became a cerebral activity and not an emotionally felt experience. But since the new imposed languages could never completely break the native languages as spoken, their most effective area of domination was the third aspect of language as communication, the written. The language of an African child's formal education was foreign. The language of the books he read was foreign. The language of his conceptualization was foreign. Thoughts, in him, took the visible form of a foreign language. So the written language of a child's upbringing in the school, even his spoken language within the school compound, became divorced from his spoken language at home. There was often not the slightest relationship between the child's written world, which was also the language of his schooling, and the world of his immediate environment in the family and the community. For a colonial child, the harmony existing between the three aspects of language as communication was irrevocably broken. This resulted in the disassociation of the sensibility of that child from his natural and social environment, what we might call colonial alienation. The alienation became reinforced in the teaching of history, geography, music, where bogus Europe was always the center of the universe. This disassociation, divorce, or alienation from the immediate environment becomes clearer when you look at colonial language as a carrier of culture. Since culture is a product of the history of a people, which it in turn reflects, the child was now being exposed exclusively to a culture that was a product of a world external to himself. He was being made to stand outside himself to look at himself. Catching Them Young is the title of a book on racism, class, sex, and politics in children's literature by Bob Dixon. Catching them young as an aim was even more true of a colonial child. The images of this world and his place in it implanted in a child takes years to eradicate if they ever can be. Since culture does not just reflect the world in images, but actually, through those very images, conditions a child to see the world in a certain way. The colonial child was made to see the world and where he stands in it as seen and defined by or reflected in the culture of the language of imposition. And since those images are mostly passed on through orature and literature, it meant the child would now only see the world as seen in the literature of his language of adoption. From the point of view of alienation, that is, of seeing oneself from outside oneself, as if one was another self. It does not matter that the imported literature carried the great humanist tradition of the best in Shakespeare, Goethe, Balzac, Tolstoy, Gorky, Brecht, Sholokhov, Dixon. The location of this great mirror of imagination was necessarily Europe and its history and culture, and the rest of the universe was seen from that center. But obviously, it was worse when the colonial child was exposed to images of his world as mirrored in the written languages of his colonizer, where his own native languages were associated in his impressionable mind with low status, humiliation, corporal punishment, slow-footed intelligence and ability, or downright stupidity, non-intelligibility and barbarism. This was reinforced by the word he met in the works of such genesis of racism as a Rider Haggard or a Nicholas Montserrat, not to mention the pronouncement of some of the giants of Western intellectual and political establishment, such as Hume, the Negro is naturally inferior to the white. Thomas Jefferson, the blacks are inferior to the white on the endowment of both body and mind. Or Hegel, with his African comparable to a land of childhood still enveloped in the dark mantle of the night as far as the development of self-conscious history was concerned. Hegel's statement that there was nothing harmonious with humanity to be found in the African character is representative of the racist images of Africans, and Africa, such a colonial child, was bound to encounter in the literature of the colonial languages. The results could be disastrous. In her paper read to the conference on the teaching of African literature in schools held in Nairobi, 1973, entitled Written Literature and Black Images, the Kenyan writer and scholar Professor Mitsere Mogo related how a reading of the description of Gagul as an old African woman in Rider Haggard's King Solomon Mines had for a long time made her feel mortal terror whenever she encountered old African women. In his autobiography, This Life, Sidney Poitier describes how, as a result of the literature he had read, he had come to associate Africa with snakes. So on arrival in Africa and being put up in a modern hotel in a modern city, he could not sleep because he kept on looking for snakes everywhere, even under the bed. These two have been able to pinpoint the origins of their fears. But for most others, the negative image becomes internalized and it affects their cultural and even political choices in ordinary living. Thus, Leopold Sédar Sr. had said very clearly that although the colonial language had been forced upon him, if he had been given the choice, he would still have opted for French. He becomes lyrical in his subservience to French. We express ourselves in French since French has a universal vocation and since our message is also addressed to French people and others. In our languages, that is African languages, the halo that resounds the words is by nature merely that of sap and blood. French words send out thousands of rays like diamonds. Senior has been rewarded by being appointed to an honored place in the French Academy, that institution for safeguarding the purity of the French language. In Malawi, Banda has erected his own monument by way of an institution, the Kamuzu Academy, designed to aid the brightest pupils of Malawi in their mastery of English. It is a grammar school designed to produce boys and girls who will be sent to universities like Harvard, Chicago, Oxford, Cambridge, and Edinburgh and be able to compete on equal terms with others elsewhere. The president has instructed that Latin should occupy a central place in the curriculum. All teachers must have had at least some Latin in their academic background. Dr. Banda has often said that no one can fully master English without knowledge of languages such as Latin and French. For good measure, no Malawian is allowed to teach at the academy. None is good enough, and all the teaching staff has been recruited from Britain. A Malawian might lower the standards, or rather the purity of the English language. Can you get a more telling example of hatred of what is national and a servile worship of what is foreign, even though dead? In history books and popular commentaries on Africa, too much has been made of the supposed differences in the policies of the various colonial powers. The British indirect rule, or the pragmatism of the British in their lack of a cultural program, and the French and Portuguese conscious program of cultural assimilation. These are a matter of detail and emphasis. The final effect was the same. Senyong's embrace of French as this language with a universal vocation is not so different from Chinua Achebe's gratitude in 1964 to English. Those of us who have inherited the English language may not be in a position to appreciate the value of the inheritance. The assumptions behind the practice of those of us who have abandoned our mother tongue and adopted European ones as the creative vehicle of our imagination are not different either. Thus, the 1962 Conference of African Writers of English Expression was only recognizing, with approval and pride of course, what through all the years of selective education and rigorous tutelage we had already been led to accept, the fatalistic logic of unassailable position of English in our literature. The logic was embodied deep in imperialism, and it was imperialism and its effect that we did not examine in Makerere. It is the final triumph of a system of domination when the dominated start singing its virtues. The 20 years that followed the Makerere Conference gave the world a unique literature, novels, stories, poems, plays written by Africans in European languages, which soon consolidated itself into a tradition with companion studies and a scholarly industry. Right from its conception, it was the literature of the petty bourgeoisie born of the colonial schools and universities. It could not be otherwise, given the linguistic medium of its message. Its rise and development reflected a gradual accession of this class to political and even economic dominance. But the petty bourgeoisie in Africa was a large class with different strands in it. It ranged from that section which looked forward to a permanent alliance with imperialism, in which it played the role of an intermediary between the bourgeoisie of the Western metropolis and the people of the colonies. The section which in my book detained a writer's prison diary, I have described as the comprador bourgeoisie. To that section which saw the future in terms of a vigorous independent national economy in African capitalism or some kind of socialism, what I shall here call the nationalistic or patriotic bourgeoisie. The literature by Africans in European languages was specifically that of the nationalistic bourgeoisie in its creators, its thematic concerns, and its consumption. Internationally, the literature helped this class, which in politics, business, and education was assuming leadership of the countries newly emergent from colonialism or of those struggling to so emerge, to explain Africa to the world. Africa had a past and a culture of dignity and human complexity. Internally, the literature gave this class a cohesive tradition and a common literary frame of references, which it otherwise lacked with its uneasy roots in the culture of the peasantry and in the culture of the metropolitan bourgeoisie. The literature added confidence to the class. The petty bourgeoisie now had a past, a culture, and a literature with which to confront the racist bigotry of Europe. This confidence manifested in the tone of the writing, its sharp critique of European bourgeois civilization, its implications, particularly in its negritude mode, that Africa had something new to give to the world, reflects the political ascendancy of the patriotic nationalistic section of the petty bourgeoisie before and immediately after independence. So initially, this literature, in the post-war world of national democratic revolutionary and anti-colonial liberation in China and India, armed uprisings in Kenya and Algeria, the independence of Ghana and Nigeria with others impending, was part of that great anti-colonial and anti-imperialist upheaval in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Caribbean islands. It was inspired by the general political awakening. It drew its stamina and even form from the peasantry, their proverbs, fables, stories, riddles, and wise sayings. It was shot through and through with optimism. But later, when the compradors section assumed political ascendancy and strengthened rather than weakened the economic links with imperialism in what was clearly a neo-colonial arrangement, this literature became more and more critical, cynical, disillusioned, bitter, and denunciatory in tone. It was almost unanimous in its portrayal, with varying degrees of detail, emphasis, and clarity of vision, of the post-independence betrayal of hope. But to whom was it directing its list of mistakes made, crimes and wrongs committed, complaints unheeded, or its call for a change of moral direction? The imperialist bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie in power, the military itself part and parcel of that class? It sought another audience, principally the peasantry and the working class, or what was generally conceived as the people. The search for new audience and new directions was reflected in the quest for simpler forms, in the adoption of a more direct tone, and often in a direct call for action. It was also reflected in the content. Instead of seeing Africa as one undifferentiated mass of historically wronged blackness, it now attempted some sort of class analysis and evaluation of neo-colonial societies. But this search was still within the confines of the languages of Europe, whose use is now defended with less vigor and confidence. So its quest was hampered by the very language choice and in its movement toward the people. It could only go up to that section of the petit bourgeoisie, the students, teachers, secretaries for instance, still in closest touch with the people. It settled there, marking time, caged within the linguistic fence of its colonial inheritance. Its greatest weakness still lay where it has always been, in the audience, the petit bourgeois readership automatically assumed by the very choice of language. Because of its indeterminate economic position between the many contending classes, the petit bourgeoisie develops a vacillating psychological makeup. Like a chameleon, it takes on the color of the main class with which it is in the closest touch and sympathy. It can be swept to activity by the masses at a time of revolutionary tide, or be driven to silence, fear, cynicism, withdrawal into self-contemplation, existential anguish, or to collaboration with the powers that be at times of reactionary tides. In Africa, this class has always oscillated between the imperialist bourgeoisie and its comprador neo-colonial ruling elements on the one hand, and the peasantry and the working class, the masses, on the other. This very lack of identity in its social and psychological makeup as a class was reflected in the very literature it produced. The crisis of identity was assumed in that very preoccupation with definition at the Makerere Conference. In literature, as in politics, it spoke as if its identity or the crisis of its own identity was that of a society as a whole. The literature it produced in European languages was given the identity of African literature as if there had never been literature in African languages. Yet, by avoiding a real confrontation with the language issue, it was clearly wearing false robes of identity. It was a pretender to the throne of the mainstream of African literature. The practitioner of what Jan Heinz Jan called Neo-African literature tried to get out of the dilemma by over-insisting that European languages were really African languages, or by trying to Africanize English or French usage while making sure it was still recognizable as English or French or Portuguese. In the process, this literature created, falsely and even absurdly, an English-speaking or French or Portuguese African peasantry and working class, a clear negation or falsification of the historical process and reality. This European language-speaking peasantry and working class, existing only in novels and dramas, was at times invested with the vacillating mentality, the evasive self-contemplation, the existential anguished human condition, or the man torn between two worlds-facedness of the petit bourgeoisie. In fact, if it had been left entirely to this class, African languages would have ceased to exist with independence. But African languages refused to die. They would not simply go the way of Latin to become the fossils of linguistic archaeology to dig up, classify, and argue about at international conferences. These languages, these national heritages of Africa, were kept alive by the peasantry. The peasantry saw no contradiction between speaking their own mother tongues and belonging to a larger national or continental geography. They saw no necessary antagonistic contradiction between belonging to their immediate nationality, to their multinational state along the Berlin-drawn boundaries, and to Africa as a whole. These people happily spoke Wolof, Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo, Arabic, Amharic, Kiswahili, Kikuyu, Luo, Luya, Shona, Ndebele, Kumbudu, Zulu, or Lingala, without this fact tearing the multinational states apart. During the anti-colonial struggle, they showed an unlimited capacity to unite around whatever leader or party best and most consistently articulated an anti-imperialist position. If anything, it was the petty bourgeoisie, particularly the compradors, with their French and English and Portuguese, with their petty rivalries, their ethnic chauvinism, which encouraged these vertical divisions to be points of war at times. No, the peasantry had no complexes about their languages and the cultures they carried. In fact, when the peasantry and working class were compelled by necessity or history to adopt the language of the master, they Africanized it without any of the respect for its ancestry shown by Senyo and Achebe, so totally as to have created new African languages like Creole in Sierra Leone or Pidgin in Nigeria that owed their identities to the syntax and rhythms of African languages. All these languages were kept alive in the daily speech, in the ceremonies and political struggles, above all in the rich store of orature, proverbs, stories, poems, and riddles. The peasantry and the urban working class threw up singers. These sang the old songs or composed new ones, incorporating the new experiences in industries and urban life and in working class struggle and organizations. These singers push the languages to new limits, renewing and reinvigorating them by coining new words and new expressions, and in generally expanding their capacity to incorporate new happenings in Africa and the world. The peasantry and the working class threw up their own writers or attracted to their ranks and consigned intellectuals from among the petit bourgeoisie, who all wrote in African languages. It is these writers like Heroi Velda Selassie, Gamakov Takla Hawariat, Shaban Roberts, Abdulatif Abdallah, Ibrahim Hussein, Euphrates Kezilahabi, B.H. Filakazi, Okot P. Bitek, A.C. Jordan, P. Mboya, D.O. Fagunwa, Mazisi Kunene, and many others rightly celebrated in Albert Gerard's pioneering survey of literature in African languages from the 10th century to the present, called African Language Literatures, 1981, who have given our languages a written literature. Thus, the immortality of our languages in print has been ensued despite the internal and external pressures for their extinction. In Kenya, I would like to single out Gakara Wewanjo, who was jailed by the British for the 10 years between 1952 and 1962 because of his writing in Gikuyu. His book, Nwandike wa Mau Ntamanirioni, a diary he secretly kept while in political detention, was published by Heinemann Kenya and won the 1984 Noma Award. It is a powerful work, extending the range of the Gikuyu language prose, and it is a crowning achievement to the work he started in 1946. He has worked in poverty, in the hardship of prison, in post-independence isolation, when the English language held sway in Kenyan school from nursery to university, and in every walk of the national printed word. But he never broke his faith in the possibilities of Kenya's national languages. His inspiration came from the mass anti-colonial movement of Kenyan people, particularly the militant wing grouped around Mau Mau, or the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, which in 1952 ushered in the era of modern guerrilla warfare in Africa. He is the clearest example of those writers thrown up by the mass political movement of an awakened peasantry and working class. And finally, from among the European language-speaking African petit bourgeoisie, there emerged a few who refused to join the chorus of those who had accepted the fatalistic logic of the position of European languages in our literary being. It was one of these, Obi Wale, who pulled the carpet from under the literary feet of those who gathered at Makerere in 1962 by declaring in an article published in Transition, 10 September 1963, that the whole uncritical acceptance of English and French as the inevitable medium for educated African writing is misdirected and has no chance of advancing African literature and culture, and that until African writers accepted that any true African literature must be written in African languages, they would merely be pursuing a dead end. What we would like future conferences on African literature to devote time to is the all-important problem of African writing in African languages and all its implications for the development of a truly African sensibility. Obiwali had his predecessors. Indeed, people like David Diop of Senegal had put the case against this use of colonial languages even more strongly. The African creator, deprived of the use of his language and cut off from his people, might turn out to be only the representative of a literary trend, and that's not necessarily the least gratuitous of the conquering nation. His works, having become a perfect illustration of the assimilationist policy through imagination and style, will doubtless rouse the warm applause of a certain group of critics. In fact, these praises will go mostly to colonialism, which, when it can no longer keep its subjects in slavery, transforms them into docile intellectuals patterned after Western literary fashions, which besides is another more subtle form of bastardization. David Diop quite correctly saw that the use of English and French was a matter of temporary historical necessity. Surely, in an Africa freed from oppression, it will not occur to any writer to express otherwise than in his discovered language his feelings and the feelings of his people. The importance of Obiwali's intervention was in tone and timing. It was published soon after the 1962 Makerere Conference of African Writers of English Expression. It was polemical and aggressive, poured ridicule and scorn on the choice of English and French, while being unapologetic in its call for the use of African languages. Not surprisingly, it was met with hostility and then silence. But 20 years of uninterrupted dominance of literature in European languages, the reactionary tone that political and economic events in Africa have taken, and the search for a revolutionary break with the neo-colonial status quo, all compel soul searching among writers, raising once again the entire question of the language of African literature. The question is this: we as African writers have always complained about the neo-colonial economic and political relationship to Europe-America. Right, but by our continuing to write in foreign languages, paying homage to them, are we not, on the cultural level, continuing that neo-colonial slavish and cringing spirit? What is the difference between a politician who says Africa cannot do without imperialism and a writer who says Africa cannot do without European languages? While we were busy haranguing the ruling circles in a language which automatically excluded the participation of the peasantry and the working class in the debate, imperialist culture and African reactionary forces had a field day. The Christian Bible is available in unlimited quantities in even the tiniest African language. The Comprado ruling cliques are also quite happy to have the peasantry and the working class all to themselves. Distortions, dictatorial directives, decrees, museum-type fossils paraded as African culture, feudalistic ideologies, superstitions, lies, all these backward elements and more are communicated to the African masses in their own languages without any challenges from those with alternative visions of tomorrow who have deliberately cocooned themselves in English, French, and Portuguese. It is ironic that the most reactionary African politician, the one who believes in selling Africa to Europe, is often a master of African languages, that the most zealous of European missionaries who believed in rescuing Africa from itself, even from the paganism of its languages, were nevertheless masters of African languages, which they often reduced to writing. The European missionary believed too much in his mission of conquest not to communicate it in the languages most readily available to the people. The African writer believes too much in African literature to write it in those ethnic, divisive, and underdeveloped languages of the peasantry. The added irony is that what they have produced, despite any claims to the contrary, is not African literature. The editors of the Pelican Guides to English Literature in their latest volume were right to include a discussion of this literature as part of 20th century English literature, just as the French Academy was right to honor Seigneur for his genuine and talented contribution to French literature and language. What we have created is another hybrid tradition, a tradition in transition, a minority tradition that can only be termed as Afro-European literature, that is, the literature written by Africans in European languages. It has produced many writers and works of genuine talent: Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, Ayikwe Ama, Sembene Usman, Agostino Neto, Seda Senyor, and many others. Who can deny their talent? The light in the products of their fertile imaginations has certainly illuminated important aspects of the African being in its continuous struggle against the political and economic consequences of Berlin and after. However, we cannot have our cake and eat it. Their work belongs to an Afro-European literary tradition which is likely to last for as long as Africa is under the rule of European capital in a new colonial setup. So Afro-European literature can be defined as literature written by Africans in European languages in the era of imperialism. But some are coming round to the inescapable conclusion articulated by Obi Wale with such polemical vigor 20 years ago. African literature can only be written in African languages, that is, the languages of the African peasantry and working class, the major alliance of classes in each of our nationalities, and the agency for the coming inevitable revolutionary break with neocolonialism. I started writing in Gikuyu language in 1977 after 17 years of involvement in Afro-European literature, in my case, Afro-English literature. It was then I collaborated with Ngũgĩ Wamiri in the drafting of the play script Ngahika Ndenda. The English translation was I Will Marry When I Want. I have since published a novel in Gikuyu, Kaitani Mutarabaini, English translation, Devil on the Cross, and completed a musical drama, Maitu Njugira, English translation, Mother, Sing for Me. 3 books for children, Njamba Nene na Mbanti, Imatango Matitora ya Njamba Nene, Njamba Nene na Chibo, Kingangi, as well as another novel manuscript, Matigari Ma Njurungi. Wherever I have gone, particularly in Europe, I have been confronted with the question, why are you now writing in Gikuyu? Why do you now write in an African language? In some academic quarters, I have been confronted with the rebuke, why have you abandoned us? It was almost as if in choosing to write in Gikuyu, I was doing something abnormal. But Gikuyu is my mother tongue. The very fact that what common sense dictates in the literary practice of other cultures is being questioned in an African writer is a measure of how far imperialism has distorted the view of African realities. It has turned reality upside down. The abnormal is viewed as normal, and the normal is viewed as abnormal. Africa actually enriches Europe, but Africa is made to believe that it needs Europe to rescue it from poverty. Africa's natural and human resources continue to develop Europe and America, but Africa is made to feel grateful for aid from the same quarters that still sit on the back of the continent. Africa even produces intellectuals who now rationalize this upside-down way of looking at Africa. I believe that my writing in Gikuyu language, a Kenyan language, an African language, is part and parcel of the anti-imperialist struggles of Kenyan and African peoples. In schools and universities, our Kenyan languages, that is the language of the many nationalities which make up Kenya, were associated with negative qualities of backwardness, underdevelopment, humiliation, and punishment. We who went through that school system were meant to graduate with a hatred of the people and the culture and the values of the language of our daily humiliation and punishment. I do not want to see Kenyan children growing up in that imperialist imposed tradition of contempt for the tools of communication developed by their communities and their history. I want them to transcend colonial alienation. Colonial alienation takes two interlinked forms: an active or passive distancing of oneself from the reality around, and an active or passive identification with that which is most external to one's environment. It starts with a deliberate disassociation of the language of conceptualization, of thinking, of formal education, of mental development from the language of daily interaction in a home and in the community. It is like separating the mind from the body so that they are occupying two unrelated linguistic spheres in the same person. On a larger social scale, it is like producing a society of bodiless heads and headless bodies. So, I would like to contribute towards the restoration of the harmony between all the aspects and divisions of language so as to restore the Kenyan child to his environment, understand it fully so as to be in a position to change it for his collective good. I would like to see Kenyan people's mother's tongue, our national languages, carry a literature reflecting not only the rhythms of a child's spoken expression, but also his struggle with nature and his social nature. Without harmony between himself, his language, and his environment as his starting point, he can learn other languages and even enjoy the positive humanistic, democratic, and revolutionary elements in other people's literatures and cultures without any complexes about his own language, his own self, his environment. The all-Kenya national language, that is Kiswahili, the other national languages, that is the languages of the nationalities like Luo, Gikuyu, Maasai, Luya, Kalenjin, Kamba, Mijikenda, Somali, Gala, Turkana, Arabic-speaking people, etc. Other African languages like Hausa, Wolof, Yoruba, Igbo, Zulu, Nyanja, Lingala, Kimbundu, and foreign languages that is foreign to Africa like English, French, German, Russian, Chinese, Japanese, Portuguese, Spanish will fall into their proper perspective in the lives of Kenyan children. Chinua Achebe once decried the tendency of African intellectuals to escape into abstract universalism in the words that apply even more to the issue of the language of African literature. Africa has had such a fate in the world that the very objective African can call up hideous fears of rejection. Better then to cut all the links with his homeland, this liability, and become in one giant leap the universal man. I understand this anxiety, but running away from oneself seems to me a very inadequate way of dealing with an anxiety. And if writers should opt for such escapism, who is to meet the challenge? Who indeed? We African writers are bound by our calling to do for our languages what Spencer, Milton, and Shakespeare did for English, what Pushkin and Tolstoy did for Russian. Indeed, what all writers in world history have done for their languages by meeting the challenge of creating a literature in them, which process later opens the language for philosophy, science, technology, and all the other areas of human creative endeavors. But writing in our languages per se, although a necessary first step in the correct direction, will not itself bring about the renaissance in African cultures if that literature does not carry the content of our people's anti-imperialist struggles to liberate their productive forces from foreign control. The content of the need for unity among the workers and peasants of all the nationalities in their struggle to control the wealth they produce and to free it from internal and external parasites. In other words, writers in African languages should reconnect themselves to the revolutionary traditions of an organized peasantry and working class in Africa in their struggle to defeat imperialism and create a higher system of democracy and socialism in alliance with all the other peoples of the world. Unity in that struggle will ensure unity in our multilingual diversity. It will also reveal the real links that bind the people of Africa to the peoples of Asia, South America, Europe, Australia and New Zealand, Canada and the USA. But it is precisely when writers open out African languages to the real links in the struggles of peasants and workers that they will meet their biggest challenge. For to the Comprado ruling regimes, their real enemy is an awakened peasantry and working class. A writer who tries to communicate the message of revolutionary unity and hope in the languages of the people becomes a subversive character. It is then that writing in African languages becomes a subversive or treasonable offense, with such a writer facing possibilities of prison, exile or even death. For him, there are no national accolades, no New Year honors, only abuse and slander and innumerable lies from the mouths of the armed power of a ruling minority. Ruling, that is, on behalf of US-led imperialism, and who see in democracy a real threat. A democratic participation of the people in the shaping of their own lives or in discussing their own lives in languages that allow for mutual comprehension is seen as being dangerous to the good government of a country and its institutions. African languages addressing themselves to the lives of the people become the enemy of a new colonial state.